Good evening. I want to thank Jim for the kind introduction and extend my appreciation to the Heartland Institute, Dr. Hielskamp in particular, for the opportunity to be here tonight and address all of you. And I won't go without mentioning my former legislator, State Senator John Coghill's in the audience from North Pole. And, just going to run through a few things here, a bit of an update on all things energy that we are doing at the Department of the Interior, and specifically the theme, the mission that the Secretary and the President have provided us, and that is to achieve energy dominance. As Jim identified, my background, my history, I think it's prepared me rather well for the job that I have now, serving the American people in managing our public lands. In my current capacity, I oversee policy development for 4 bureaus that each play a significant role in the management of our nation's energy resources. They're the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Office of Surface Mining and Regulatory Enforcement. I don't have to tell you, but as a nation, we are incredibly blessed with natural resources that other nations simply dream about. And we've had the wisdom of forethought in the decades prior to manage these resources responsibly, and it's helped make America what it is, what it has been, and if we get things right, what it will be. These opportunities that Americans have, we have these resources that allow us unparalleled opportunities for energy production, job creation, and even recreation. Those opportunities only come about through sound management, and they get realized when we manage thoughtfully and deliberately. And let me tell you, this administration is taking some very deliberate actions. Our current efforts are focused on an all-of-the-above strategy for energy, and at our department specifically, what you might call an all-of-the-above public lands strategy. It aims to maximize the public benefit for our country's vast resources. I'm honored to support the President and Secretary Zinke in realizing the nation's potential and fulfilling promises made to the American people during a campaign. We're actually engaged in this novel approach where we're doing what the President said he would do. And that's something that not everybody's prepared for. At the department, we're engaged really on the front lines. We're at the forefront of the Trump administration's efforts to reduce regulatory burdens that limit economic growth and undercut America's ability to access raw materials domestically. Last year, this administration rolled back 22 regulations for every one that it proposed and created. Unfortunately, I think we need about a decade of that rate to get back to a reasonable place. We seek to be partners in progress to help achieve a future where America isn't just energy independent, but energy dominant. But make no mistake, energy dominance is not just a talking point. It's a set of principles, a strategy. It guides development of our policy every day. These principles are exemplified by a series of secretarial orders where the Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke laid out specific missions for us to accomplish in pursuit of these policies and goals. We've got an order to end the federal coal lease moratorium and ordering coal lease processing to resume. Directing the bureaus to review specific actions that burden oil and gas development, and a reevaluation of departmental mitigation policies and practices. Directing the development of a new 5-year program for offshore oil and gas leasing, and a review of regulatory and procedural burdens whose removal would enhance opportunities for energy exploration, leasing, and production. Directing a review and evaluation of our resources and management of the Alaska North Slope, NPRA, and the 1002 area in ANWR. directing BLM to hold quarterly oil and gas lease sales and to identify ways to promote exploration and development of federal onshore oil and gas, and streamlining reviews under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. That's a four-letter word. To expedite compliance with the Act's requirements for the environmental reviews that precede major federal agency decisions. These orders demonstrate the administration has recognized from its beginning that energy and mineral resource development is an important economic driver. It brings to market important commodities that have become essential to our everyday lives. We would rather that those resources we depend on be produced here in America, where development can create jobs and be undertaken in a responsible, environmentally conscious manner using the best management practices and best science available. In order to do that, we need to pursue policies that foster vibrant industry ecosystems to support development in our nation's largest resource basins under federal jurisdiction, like offshore oil and gas in the Gulf and onshore oil and gas and coal in the western U.S. Up to this point, we've not been creating economically attractive energy development opportunities on federal lands. That can be seen in the stark difference between oil and gas production on federal land versus state and private land over a very particular period of time. If production on federal lands had grown at the same rate as overall U.S. production from 2009 to 2015, total royalties would have been 31% higher. We would have had an additional $20 billion in the Treasury, and that would have helped across the board. So, we're trying to implement some common sense reforms and reduce regulatory burdens and costs to energy producers that also focus our bureaus on the issues that stand in the way of permits and other approvals and allow our projects to move forward and do so more efficiently. I can tell you that the 4 bureaus I oversee are embracing their new missions with renewed enthusiasm and optimism, understanding that when America's landscapes are working, Americans are working, and revenues are flowing to the Treasury. We're also well aware of the impact that our decisions have on state economies through royalty, tax, and other revenues that federally permitted projects generate in addition to their local economic impacts. We're in Louisiana today, one of the 4 oil and gas producing states under Go Mesa. In 2018, Secretary Zinke and the administration distributed $188 million in Go Mesa Phase 2 funding to the Gulf states for coastal conservation, restoration, and hurricane protection. That amount is over 5 times more than the total amount distributed to states from FY 2009 to FY 17 under Phase 1. That right there is a perfect example that shows American energy dominance is going to have an impact right here at home. Under Secretary Zinke's leadership, much of 2017 was spent taking a look at the various ways that our public lands and waters are made available for development of energy and mineral resources. As a result, the department has opened up and will continue to find ways to open up federal lands to energy development at an increasing rate. Onshore, the Bureau of Land Management manages about 245 million surface acres and 700 million subsurface acres, located primarily in just 12 western states. Of that, 26 million surface acres are currently under lease for oil and gas development, on which there are 94,000 wells, active wells. According to a recent economic study conducted for the BLM, that set of activity generates $42 billion in economic output. Onshore activity accounts for 6% of total U.S. oil production and almost 10% of natural gas production, and it supports 200,000 jobs nationwide. Providing increased access to federal lands is the critical first step on a path towards increasing onshore production numbers and achieving our stated goals. In 2017, BLM held 28 onshore oil and gas lease sales, a 30% increase from the number held the year prior. These onshore sales generated more than $350 million in total receipts, and you can compare this to the year prior when the previous administration generated $193 million. In line with the Secretary's order on onshore energy development, we are looking at ways to expand the inventory of onshore federal lands available for lease, as well as continuing to lease available lands. And one way we're doing this is by further opening up frontier areas. That takes me to my home state. In Alaska, there are literally billions of barrels of oil and trillions, tens of trillions of cubic feet of natural gas on federal lands waiting, just waiting to be found, developed, and transported to markets. The National Petroleum Reserve Alaska was set aside by President Harding back in 1923 as a source of fuel for the newly converted U.S. Navy. Think about that. 95 years ago, somebody thought there was hydrocarbon potential up there. And it's not rocket science. There really is an abundance of resources up there. Curiously, though, under the last administration, the resource assessments were completely shredded, down by 90%. And I'll tell you, the geologists, the professionals who work for the state of Alaska could not believe what came out from the USGS on those numbers. And not surprisingly, following that change in assessment, the previous administration completely changed the management program for the NPRA and cut off explicitly more than half of the 22 million acres that comprise that reserve. Under Secretary Zinke's Order 3352, a new assessment was conducted. It took in input from the USGS, from BLM, and even from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. That was completed late last year, and surprise, it's now estimated that the onshore resources in that region are north of 8 billion barrels. And you know what? It was a little embarrassing that it took that long to catch up, because ConocoPhillips has been exploring in the NPRA for nearly 20 years. They're now in the final stages of developing their second production facility in the region, and with the confirmation of some exploration wells earlier in the year and announced recently as part of their obligations to the SEC, it looks like they have more than 1 billion barrels already identified. And they haven't even scratched the surface. More than 78% of their lands under lease have not yet been explored. So we've shown that oil and gas resources can be managed on the North Slope, on federal land, in a responsible manner while protecting important surface resources and subsistence activities for the local populations. And, you know, as private industry has made clear, there's a definite demand from the market for this additional acreage. And we're working now with the state of Alaska and the local government, the North Slope Borough, to redevelop an integrated activity plan in the region that will make millions more acres available for leasing and opening up some of the most prospective areas closest to the Barrow Arch. And then there's this other piece of property a little bit to the east. And while it's smaller, only about 1.5 million acres, the potential there seems to be a little greater. And that is the coastal plain in Anwar. That's an opportunity that's been made available for the first time and made possible by President Trump's historic tax cut legislation enacted at the end of last year. For the first time, we have the opportunity to expand access to oil and gas development in the 1002 area of the Arctic National Refuge. The 1.6 million acre coastal plain was specifically identified back in 1980 by Congress and the President pursuant to Section 1002 of the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act for its potential for oil and natural gas resources. Leasing, unfortunately, was subject to congressional approval, but the potential was well known, and the legislation, ANILCA, called for an in-depth study of the environment, wildlife, birds, and marine mammals in the area. And after 6 years of work, the Department of the Interior concluded that the potential was great, that it was in the public interest to pursue leasing in the coastal plain. And they recommended that Congress authorize as such. And while multiple efforts in the years since came oh so close, it took until December of 2017 to gain the necessary combination of a willing Congress and a willing president to make this happen. So how much oil is there? Well, why have we been arguing for nearly 40 years about it? The truth is, we don't actually know. We can't know until we drill holes in the ground. But there was a resource assessment done nearly 20 years ago, and it put the potential for oil at about 10 billion barrels in the most likely case. Now, that was before a whole new set of geologic plays that have become the hot commodity in NPRA lately became known to the geologists. So my expectation is that if we do our work right at the department, and I'm getting to work on this personally, if we get our environmental impact statement done and hold a lease sale sometime next year, I think there are going to be some eye-popping numbers that show up at that lease sale. I'm personally looking forward to that. This is an issue that I've been working on and paying attention to for quite some time. My senior year in high school, Nancy Plaxico was my government teacher. She had us write a paper on something hot in the civics at the time, and mine was on whether or not to open ANWR. So, you know, I feel privileged as an American, as an Alaskan, to get to work on this, and it's something that I'm truly excited about. Now, that was all onshore. We're also looking at opportunities offshore, and we have a similar strategy. We're seeking to expand the acreage that's available for leasing that's going to provide opportunities for exploration, development, jobs, and continued revenue for decades to come. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement are jointly responsible for the safe and productive development of 1.76 billion acres on the Outer Continental Shelf. Offshore, there are currently more than 16 million acres under lease, which is less than 0.1% of the Outer Continental Shelf. On just that small portion of the OCS, we currently have more than 2,100 platforms producing the resources that constitute 18% of our nation's domestic oil production and 4% of our domestic natural gas production. In January this year, the Secretary announced the draft proposed program for a new 5-year schedule of leasing, and it made over 90% of the total acreage available and more than 98% of the undiscovered, technically recoverable oil and natural gas resources available for exploration and development. In total, 47 lease sales proposed for consideration in 25 of the 26 planning areas. And in March of this year, BOEM offered the largest oil and gas lease sale in U.S. history, 77.3 million acres of OCS lands offshore Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Western Florida. Providing access and making sure that we have a steady supply of lands available for lease is the critical first step to ensuring that energy production remains at current levels or higher. As the productivity of legacy assets declines and wells are retired, it's important that we replace that productivity with new economically viable projects. And while we are continuing to see robust activity, we need to see even more in our permitting and authorizations. So, I'm sorry, I've lost my place here. So as you can see, the Trump administration has put the country on a path where our federal lands can be made available for productive uses, and that avoids missed opportunities for energy development. But it takes more than just making those lands available to get results. There has to be a sound business proposition to attract the necessary capital investment. Under the Secretary's guidance, the Department released an energy burdens report last fall, which identified agency actions that potentially burden the development or use of domestically produced energy resources, with particular attention to oil, gas, and coal. When we took a look at how some of our bureaus had been doing business, what we found were superfluous regulations and bureaucratic red tape, significant barriers to the responsible development of our nation's resources. By identifying and, where appropriate, eliminating these obstacles, we've begun a course to reduce barriers, review and streamline the leasing and permitting processes, support improved transmission and pipeline development, and improve coordination among key stakeholders, in particular state, local, and tribal governments, as well as other federal agencies and the public. In 2017, many respects was a transformative year for coal in the federal context. One of the Secretary's first actions was to overturn the previous administration's moratorium on coal leasing. That banned leasing on all federal lands. That war on coal is over. We also worked with Congress to rescind the overly burdensome stream protection rule. And when it comes to coal, we don't think the Department of the Interior or anyone in the federal government should be picking winners and losers in the energy space. We believe the market should figure that out. From January 2017 to March 2018, we've issued 7 new coal leases by application. We've approved 70 new coal mine plans, and these approvals positively impact 1,900 employees with those associated mines. That's 1,900 families. That's 1,900 sets of students going to schools, members of the PTA, paying property taxes, making America what we all know and love. With respect to onshore lands, the BLM has taken a number of regulatory actions to reduce burdens there as well. 2 of them in particular get my attention as someone who spent time working in state government on the regulatory side. In December of 2017, BLM temporarily suspended and delayed certain provisions and requirements of the 2016 venting and flaring rule. The previous administration had pushed this one through over the strong objections of many state governments. It upset decades of precedent with regard to how we count waste. And it was all, in many people's understanding and belief, just a cloak, just a cover to use federal land management and royalty policy to regulate emissions. And that's something that at least one judge found fault with and enjoined. And so as this year came along, as I was able to move into office, I had the distinct pleasure of getting to sign the elimination of, the proposed rule for revisions to update and modernize what had been a traditional understanding about what constitutes waste, what's allowed to be used royalty-free, and we're now in the final stages working with OMB to update and prepare the final rule for publication in the coming weeks. Also, earlier this year, we were able to rescind the 2015 hydraulic fracturing rule, something that was particularly pernicious because when we took a deep dive and looked at the facts, for all 32 states where BLM has oil and gas leases and production, every single one of those states already had rules in place to govern and regulate hydraulic fracturing. So it was astounding that we needed to come up with a federal version of a rule that's already in place that's tailored to the specific needs, geology, and aquifers of a given locale in any part of the country. And beyond that, we already had regulations that allowed BLM to take specific care for specific federal resources. And so it was really quite curious. Had we not intervened, had President Trump not been elected and had this rule gone into effect, the consequences of implementation would have been increased cost for wells, imposed a number of burdensome administrative requirements, and had the effect of turning producers away from federal lands and even more pressure on private and state lands. So we think that making these changes is going to improve the attractiveness of federal land and activity on that federal land. As we look offshore, the department's already taken a number of actions to address regulatory overreach and make offshore oil and gas development financially attractive. Bessie has issued proposed rules revising the well control rule and the production safety system rule. Each one of these sets out a series of regulatory revisions that could greatly increase regulatory certainty and reduce costs for offshore drilling and production, all while maintaining a regulatory program that represents one of the strongest offshore safety and environmental protection regimes in the world. The proposed offshore leasing program and regulatory revisions are a signal to the global marketplace that the United States intends to remain a global leader in responsible offshore energy development that produces affordable American energy for decades to come. Rather than the regulatory onslaught that we saw over the past several years, the current administration seeks to achieve a more effective balance between development and strict environmental protection by strategically reviewing, revising, or rescinding regulations to increase the economic attractiveness of resource extraction on our lands. We're working to streamline our resource management planning and permitting processes, both onshore and offshore, in an effort to give producers the answers and process certainty they need to make investments to produce the energy and create the jobs that are so vital to our economy. The more efficient we can become in our decision-making processes, the faster we will see the effects of increased energy production on federal lands, and the sooner the American public will see a return on our natural resource wealth. From the outset of this administration, we've been working to improve the ways we make our public lands available, balance stakeholder interests within a multiple use framework, and ensure that energy development is fairly and equally considered in order to ensure a strong and vibrant economy. The Secretary has established a very clear set of guiding principles in this regard: to sustainably develop our natural resources, to restore trust and be a good neighbor, to strike a regulatory balance, and to modernize our infrastructure. From my first day on the job, the Secretary has made clear to me that the department, as the steward of America's public lands, is not going to cut corners on our important environmental laws. But being a good steward of shared lands means being a good neighbor, being a good listener. We appreciate the work that you do and your willingness to share your perspectives. Thank you again for the invitation to speak this evening, and I look forward to continuing to work with and on behalf of all of you. Thanks.